She was shaking when she asked him. Dirty shoes, torn jacket, eyes too old for a child. Can you give me a hug, please? The cafe went silent. The single dad froze, because if he touched her, everything he'd buried for years would come rushing back. What he did next made the girl cry, and revealed a secret no one was ready for. If you believe one moment can change two broken lives forever, hit subscribe now, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. The bell above the cafe door gave a tired jingle, the kind that sounded like it had rung for too many lonely people and not enough happy ones, and Daniel Harper barely looked up because he had trained himself not to. Trained himself over years of survival to keep his eyes on his coffee cup, his hands wrapped around cheap ceramic warmth, his mind focused on the schedule of his daughter's school pickup and the overtime shift he had begged for the night before. He was a single dad in a city that didn't care, a man whose shoulders had learned the exact weight of responsibility and grief, and whose face had learned how to stay neutral even when memories screamed. That was when the girl stood beside his table. She was small, too small for her age, and her clothes looked borrowed from life itself. A jacket with a broken zipper, sleeves too long, shoes cracked at the toes, hair pulled into a loose ponytail that had lost its fight hours ago. Her eyes were the kind people didn't like to meet because they forced you to feel something, the kind of eyes that had learned disappointment early and carried it quietly. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for food. She didn't even look at the pastries behind the glass. She looked at him and said, barely above a whisper, "Can you give me a hug, please?" Time didn't stop, but something inside Daniel did. His fingers tightened around the cup. His chest locked. Because the last time a child had asked him for a hug, it had been his son, and the hospital room had smelled like antiseptic and regret, and he had promised a hug would come after the machines stopped beeping. That hug never came, and since then, Daniel didn't touch children who weren't his own, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't trust himself to survive it. The cafe felt too bright, too loud, even though no one was speaking. People noticed. They always did when discomfort entered a room. A woman at the counter frowned. A man pretended not to see. Someone muttered, "Where are her parents?" The girl's hands trembled, but she didn't step back. She stood there like someone who had already decided rejection was acceptable but hope was worth the risk. Daniel shook his head before he realized he was doing it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice rough, "I can't." The word hit her harder than a shove. Her eyes filled instantly, not with loud sobs, but with the silent kind, the kind children learn when crying too openly makes things worse. She nodded fast, like she'd practiced this response, and whispered, "Okay. Thank you anyway." She turned to leave, shoulders collapsing inward, and that was when Daniel saw the bruise on her wrist, yellow and purple and shaped like fingers. Something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let the pain leak out. He stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Wait," he said, louder than he meant to. The girl froze. Slowly, she turned back. "I can't hug you," he said, swallowing, "but I can sit with you." She hesitated. Adults made promises that didn't last. But she nodded. He pulled out the chair. She sat like she was afraid of taking up space. He ordered her hot chocolate without asking. When it came, she wrapped both hands around the mug like it was a lifeline. Tears fell anyway, not because she didn't get the hug, but because someone stayed. They talked, if you could call it that. She told him her name was Lily. She didn't say where she lived. She said her mom worked far away, and came home when she could. Daniel didn't push. He told her he had a daughter named Emma who loved drawing cats with wings. Lily smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that hurt to see. When Daniel finally walked her outside, he watched her disappear down the street alone. He didn't know then that he had just stepped into a story that would rip his life open and stitch it back together in a way he never saw coming. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Lily's voice followed him through the dark apartment, mixing with the sound of Emma's soft breathing from the next room. He stared at the ceiling and remembered the social worker's clipboard, the courtroom echo, the accusation in his ex-in-law's eyes when they said he worked too much, when they said grief had turned him cold. They didn't know what it took to keep a roof over a child's head while carrying a grave in your chest. The next day, he returned to the cafe at the same time. He told himself it was coincidence. It wasn't. Lily was there, sitting on the curb outside, hugging her knees. When she saw him, she stood so fast she almost tripped. "Hi," she said, like she hadn't expected him to exist again. He sat beside her. He brought a sandwich. She ate like someone used to sharing hunger with silence. Over days, a routine formed. He learned she slept wherever her mom's shift ended, sometimes a car, sometimes a friend's couch, sometimes nowhere stable enough to name. He learned her favorite color was yellow because it reminded her of mornings that felt safe. He learned she had nightmares and woke up apologizing. Daniel learned something else too. People were watching her, but not helping. Teachers assumed. Neighbors judged. Systems waited for paperwork while children waited for comfort. One afternoon, Lily flinched when a man shouted nearby. Daniel's hands curled into fists before he could stop himself. That instinct scared him. It also woke something long buried. He realized why he couldn't hug her. Not because she wasn't his child, but because part of him had already decided to protect her like one. The twist came on a rainy evening when Emma insisted on meeting, the girl Daddy talks about. Daniel hesitated, then agreed. Lily and Emma met under flickering streetlights and bonded instantly over chalk drawings and shared snacks. That night, Lily fell asleep on Daniel's couch. When he covered her with a blanket, she reached for his sleeve in her sleep. This time, he didn't pull away. He sat on the floor all night, letting her hold onto the fabric, letting the weight of responsibility settle fully. He didn't know yet that Lily's mother wasn't just absent, but running. He didn't know that the bruise was evidence in a case that would soon explode into his life. And he didn't know that the hug he had refused would become the very thing that saved all of them. The knock came just after midnight, sharp and official, the kind of sound that doesn't ask permission before it rearranges your life, and Daniel was already awake because once you become the kind of man responsible for more than one fragile soul, sleep becomes something you negotiate with, not something you trust. He moved quietly so Emma wouldn't wake, heart pounding not with fear for himself but with the instinctive calculation of consequences. Who would take her if this went wrong? How fast could he explain? How much damage truth could still do? When he opened the door, two figures stood under the dim hallway light, a police officer with tired eyes and a woman in a rain-soaked coat whose face collapsed the moment she saw Lily sleeping on the couch behind him. She rushed forward, whispering Lily's name like a prayer she was afraid might shatter if spoken too loudly, and Lily woke with a startled gasp before launching herself into her mother's arms with a force that surprised everyone in the room. Daniel watched the reunion with a complicated knot in his chest, relief tangling with dread, because relief never comes without cost. The officer explained that Lily's mother, Sarah, had escaped an abusive relationship weeks ago, had been hiding, working under the table, terrified that asking for help would send her daughter into a system she had once survived and barely escaped herself. The bruise on Lily's wrist hadn't come from a stranger, it had come from the man Sarah had finally reported that night, the man now in custody. Daniel's legs felt weak as reality snapped into focus. Lily hadn't been abandoned. She had been protected badly, imperfectly, desperately, the way only broken adults sometimes know how. But the system doesn't care about intentions, only facts, and facts began stacking quickly. Temporary housing wasn't guaranteed. Child services were already involved. A woman with a clipboard would come in the morning. Daniel found himself saying words he hadn't planned to say, offering space, stability, witnesses, anything that would keep Lily from being separated again, even as he knew how dangerous that generosity could be for his own fragile custody arrangement. Emma stood in the hallway, rubbing her eyes, taking in the scene with a child's terrifying clarity. "Is Lily staying?" she asked. No one answered. Sarah's eyes met Daniel's, full of gratitude and shame and fear, and she whispered, "She asked you for a hug because she thought you looked safe." The sentence landed harder than any accusation ever could. Morning arrived with fluorescent lights and paperwork and judgment disguised as professionalism. The caseworker asked about boundaries, about why Lily trusted him, about whether he understood how things looked. Daniel answered calmly, honestly, with the restraint of a man who had already lost once and would not afford anger the chance to lose him again. Sarah broke down when they suggested temporary foster placement. Lily clung to Daniel's jacket, fingers white-knuckled, breathing fast, old terror surfacing with brutal speed. That was when it happened. Lily looked up at him, eyes glassy but steady, and asked again, softer this time, braver somehow, "Can I have a hug now?" The room went silent. Daniel didn't think. He knelt and opened his arms. Lily fell into them like she had been waiting her whole life for permission. She sobbed, loud, unrestrained, shaking sobs that soaked through his shirt, and Daniel held her, feeling something inside him finally unclench, something that had been locked away since a hospital room years ago. He didn't cry, but his hands trembled, and everyone saw it. The caseworker saw safety, not suspicion. Sarah saw hope. Emma saw family expanding in real time. That hug changed the narrative. Sarah was granted supervised housing with support. Daniel was approved as a temporary kinship placement helper, a rare arrangement born from circumstance and trust. Weeks turned into months. Lily laughed more. Emma learned how to share space and love. Sarah healed, slowly, painfully, with the help she'd been too afraid to ask for before. On Lily's birthday, they met at the same cafe where it had all begun. Lily ran up to Daniel, hugged him without asking, then grinned. "You're my safe place," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Daniel looked at the bell above the door, at the chipped mugs, at the ordinary miracle of survival, and understood something finally. Sometimes the bravest thing a broken man can do is open his arms and let another broken soul remind him why they exist. And somewhere in that crowded cafe, unnoticed by most, two lives rewrote their endings, not because of money or power or miracles, but because one man stayed when it would have been easier to walk away, and one little girl dared to ask for exactly what she needed.